Hi there, Kay Byfield here from ArtSpeaks Studio in Dallas, Texas. We offer online classes in real time and in-studio classes here in Dallas, Texas. Today we're going to talk about shapes and what makes a good shape in a painting. The most important thing to know about shapes is that good shapes are interesting. They're not boring. They're not predictable. And in general, most good shapes are abstract. They cannot be named because they're a combination of shapes within the objects that are in the composition. So good shapes don't have any inherent meaning on their own. So this is not a good shape. This is a predictable, boring shape. And all of the shapes in this little composition are boring. The negative shape is boring, the shapes of the leaves are boring, the shapes of the apple is boring, because nothing surprises me. This is why the breakdown of a painting where all of the shapes include changes in color and value will look very much like a paint-by-number composition. Most good paintings are made up of some combination of complex and simpler shapes. Simple shapes are often geometric, which means that they can be described by mathematical formulas. Organic shapes can also be simple, but typically they tend to get more complicated. So when we have some combination of interesting shapes, they typically include both organic and geometric shapes. Getting good shapes often begins with the source of your information. If you draw something out of your head, you typically are going to get a pretty boring drawing because it's going to be superficial and not give any of the nuances of the shapes that are inherent in the subject matter that you might find by looking at nature or using a photograph. Here's a drawing that I did of a sunflower without looking at anything. It's not that different than the drawing I probably would have made as a teenager, and the shapes are boring, including the negative shapes. Instead, look at the world around you for suggestions of good shapes. But remember that nature is under no obligation to give you good shapes. So when there is a problem with the shape, it's boring, predictable, it too accurately describes the silhouette of an object and so forth, you need to be a bit inventive. In general, when we look at things from unusual viewpoints, or if there is a strong light source so that you have good shadow shapes, you will be more likely to find ways to break up your subject or combine objects together so that you result in more interesting shape. The point of view also makes a big difference. If you take an unusual point of view rather than straight on and flat looking at something, you're more likely to get more interesting shapes. So here are two photographs of sunflowers. The top one is a square composition with a front-on view of a sunflower and a very boring shape, negative shape around it. The shape of the sunflower itself is reasonably boring. The negative shape is boring. But when we take a different point of view and look at the sunflower from a 3/4 view, it's much more interesting in all of the shapes, both positive and negative. And we can see that especially when we look at contour drawings of the two different photographs. These are tracings of the photographs where I have made a new shape every time there's a change in color or value. They do look like paint by number, but that's because paint by number works. So we end up with a more interesting composition in the one with a different viewpoint, which gives us less predictable shapes, and because the lighting is strong in both of those photographs. Most successful painters do a value study before they start to plan both their values and their shapes and that will give them more likelihood of a more successful painting. Here are the value studies I did for those two photographs that I showed you based on those tracings. As you can see, here's the straight-on sunflower with 50% of it's done in mid-tone, leaving our lights, and the light is about, I don't know, 30% perhaps, and a little bit of dark, maybe 20%. The other value study is the more interesting one, the three-quarter view. And again, it's about 50% mid-tone or perhaps 60%. It's about 30% dark and 20% light. The proportions of how much light, mid-tone, and dark, how much large, medium, small, all of those elements should be in different proportions. And most artists are very conscious of that. We do not want equal proportions of things because that becomes boring. One of the big problems for many artists when they begin to paint is that it becomes confusing when one shape merges into another, as they do in this photograph of pumpkins. And artists have a tendency to separate and delineate each one of those shapes. They actually would do better to let those shapes merge when they have a strong light that gives them those kinds of indications. And we don't need to show where one pumpkin ends and the next one begins, because the painting, as the photograph, should be more about the way the light hits the surface and the textures that are created than it is about reporting the shape of each individual pumpkin. Edge control becomes a problem for artists, and some artists solve that problem by using nothing but hard edges, and some stay soft, mostly with soft edges. Even in these cases, like Mike Nichols, who uses hard edges predominantly, the successful artists are merging the different objects and breaking objects up to create less predictable shapes. So here are the rules for creating interesting shapes. 1. Shapes need to be unpredictable, and we do that by either breaking up objects' shapes or by combining object shapes so that they are unexpected. 2. Shapes need to be of varied sizes and colors and textures, and some organic and some geometric, and that variety needs to be in different proportions. So you don't have half light shapes and half dark shapes, or half organic shapes and half geometric shapes. You have some proportion that is predominant, and you have other proportions of your other amounts. This will allow you to create an interesting painting. In this painting by Margaret Martin, the painting is mostly mid-tone, punctuated by darks, and with a small proportion of lights. The third rule for creating interesting shapes is that negative shapes are just as important as positive shapes. So we always pay attention to the negative shapes by drawing a border around our composition from the very beginning and watching the way that our subject matter lays out within the composition. For example, in this little study that I did, I have a clear boundary around this little painting. My positive shapes are the trees, of course, and my negative shape is the sky. A real painting is never this simple, and in fact, that's boring in itself. But you need to always be thinking about the negative shape just as much, or perhaps even more, than you're thinking about the positive shapes. I hope this little introduction to how to create interesting shapes will be really helpful to you, and perhaps we'll see you again here at an ArtSpeaks studio moment, or even online or in our studio. In the meantime, happy painting.